In 1814, the British Royal Navy sailed into the Chesapeake Bay and tried to destroy Baltimore. They bombarded Fort McHenry for 25 straight hours with the most powerful naval force in the world and failed. Baltimore held. A lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the flag still flying at dawn and wrote what became the Star-Spangled Banner. What most Americans don't know is why the British were in the Chesapeake Bay in the first place. The War of 1812, the war that produced the Battle for Baltimore, the war that produced the national anthem, was a direct consequence of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns had blockaded British trade, strangled the British economy, and pushed Britain into a conflict with America at the worst possible moment. Baltimore's finest hour was written indirectly by a man who never set foot in America. Now it's 2026 and 80,000 soldiers of the Grande Armée, Napoleon's revolutionary fighting force, the army that conquered most of Europe in less than a decade, the most innovative military organization in the history of warfare up to that point, have landed at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Napoleon has read everything there is to read about Baltimore. He knows about Fort McHenry. He knows about the Star-Spangled Banner. He knows that the British, with the most powerful navy in the world, couldn't take this city in 1814. He has spent 6 weeks thinking about why, and he believes he knows something the British didn't. He is, as he has always been, probably right. 80,000 soldiers of the Grande Armée landing at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay represent the most tactically sophisticated ground force in the history of this series. More organized than the Mongols, more flexible than the Romans, more technologically advanced than the Spartans, and commanded by the one man in the ancient or early modern world who studied warfare the way a scientist studies physics. Napoleon Bonaparte personally commands from the front, riding between corps on his famous gray horse, dictating orders at a pace that his marshals, experienced commanders in their own right, sometimes struggle to keep up with. The force is organized in the Napoleonic corps system, 4 corps of 20,000 soldiers each corps a self-contained combined arms unit with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. 120 field cannons organized into Grande batteries. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite personal force of 8,000 veterans, held in reserve, deployed only at the decisive moment of every battle, the hammer that has never failed to fall at exactly the right time. The soldiers carry Charleville muskets, smoothbore flintlocks accurate to 50 meters, slow to reload at 3 rounds per minute, but wielded by men who have been drilled to fire in coordinated volleys that turn individual inaccuracy into collective devastation. And Napoleon himself, who once said God fights on the side with the best artillery, has made sure his artillery is very, very good. The Grande Armée's approach to Baltimore via the Chesapeake Bay is Napoleon's first tactical decision of the campaign, and it is characteristically brilliant. Every previous invader in this series approached Baltimore from the north, overland, through the I-695 corridor, through the suburban sprawl of northern Maryland. Napoleon approaches from the south, up the Chesapeake Bay, landing his force at the same general area where the British landed in 1814, not because he is copying the British, but because he has studied the geography and reached the same conclusion they did. The Chesapeake provides a water highway directly to the heart of Maryland that bypasses every defensive position an opponent would naturally prepare. On the northern land approaches, the Maryland National Guard's 29th Infantry Division, which has updated its protocols after the Spartan campaign, has its primary defensive preparations oriented north. The first drone detection of the Grande Armée's landing craft on the Chesapeake Bay at 5:22 a.m. produces a response that the Guard's operations officer later describes as the military equivalent of leaving your front door unlocked and having someone come through the back window. The alert goes to the Maryland governor's office, Fort Meade, and the Pentagon simultaneously. The Pentagon's first question, asked within 90 seconds of the alert: "Where is Napoleon in the formation?" The answer comes back 4 minutes later. He is at the front. He is always at the front. Napoleon lands with the Imperial Guard at 6:15 a.m. and immediately does what he does at the beginning of every campaign. He looks at the ground, not at maps, at the actual ground. He rides forward with a small escort, looks at the terrain between the landing site and the city to the north, looks at the Patapsco River and the inner harbor visible in the distance, looks at the elevation changes, the road network, the industrial infrastructure of the port. He has been doing this for 25 years, reading terrain the way a musician reads a score, extracting from the landscape itself the battle plan that the landscape is suggesting. What he sees in that first reconnaissance changes his initial plan within 20 minutes of landing. The plan he boarded the ships with had the artillery establishing a Grande battery on the elevated ground south of the city and reducing Fort McHenry from a distance before the infantry advanced. What the terrain tells him when he stands on it is different. Fort McHenry's star shape, which he studied extensively from historical records, means that artillery fire from the south, the approach the British used, distributes its impact across angled walls designed specifically to deflect it. What the terrain also tells him, standing where he is standing, is that the fort has a blind spot. Not a military blind spot. The fort's guns cover every approach, but a logistical blind spot. The fort was designed in 1800 to defend against naval attack from the water. Its landward defenses, the walls facing the city itself facing north, were built as a secondary consideration. Napoleon rides back to his command post. He says to his chief of staff, Marshal Berthier, changed the plan. We go around. What happens in the next 2 hours demonstrates more clearly than any previous campaign in this series why Napoleon's corps system was the most revolutionary military innovation of the early modern era. 2 corps, 40,000 soldiers, advanced directly toward Fort McHenry from the south, not to attack it but to fix it, to pin the garrison's attention and guns on the southern approach. The other 2 corps move east and north simultaneously, using the road network Napoleon identified in his reconnaissance, curving around the fort's landward flank toward the city itself. The Imperial Guard moves with Napoleon, centrally positioned, ready to reinforce whichever thrust achieves the decisive breakthrough. The operation requires 4 separate corps to move in coordinated but independent directions simultaneously, maintaining communication across a 15-mile front, adjusting to obstacles in real time without stopping to wait for orders from the center. It is, in 21st century military terminology, a combined arms envelopment executed at operational scale. The Maryland National Guard, repositioning frantically from its northern defensive orientation to respond to the southern landing, is trying to cover 2 simultaneous axes of advance with a force designed to cover 1. The Guard commander, watching the French movement develop on his drone feed at 8 a.m., calls Fort Meade with a situation report that contains a sentence no Guard commander has used in any previous ancient army campaign. Sir, they have a plan, a real one, and it's already 3 moves ahead of ours. The 2 corps fixing Fort McHenry from the south reach effective cannon range at 9:30 a.m. and Napoleon's artillery chief, a position Napoleon takes more seriously than any other in his order of battle, establishes a Grande battery of 48 guns on the elevated ground southeast of the fort. The battery opens fire at 9:45 a.m. The sound of 48 Napoleonic field cannons firing in coordinated salvos is, according to every account of every Napoleonic battle, the defining sensory experience of warfare in this era. A rolling, overlapping thunder that is qualitatively different from the sharp crack of modern artillery because it is sustained, rhythmic, and close. The Fort McHenry garrison, Maryland National Guard artillery units who have been reinforcing the fort since the Spartan campaign and have updated their protocols extensively, returns fire with modern artillery that outranges the French guns by a factor of 10 and is guided by GPS targeting that Napoleon's gunners cannot imagine. The exchange is therefore entirely one-sided in terms of accuracy and effect. Modern GPS-guided rounds versus smoothbore cannonballs. But Napoleon, Grande Battery, is not trying to destroy the fort. It is trying to keep every gun in the fort pointed south. While the garrison's attention is on the southern battery, the 2 enveloping corps are already north of the fort. The garrison commander realizes this at 10:15 a.m. when a drone feed shows French infantry moving through the streets of South Baltimore behind him. He radios the Guard commander. They're inside the perimeter. The fort is irrelevant. Napoleon enters Baltimore's inner harbor at 11:45 a.m. on horseback, riding at the front of the Imperial Guard's advance element, through streets that the previous Spartan campaign's after-action reports described in detail he has memorized. He stops at the water's edge, the same instinct that has stopped every general in this series at the first major body of water, and looks at the harbor for 6 minutes. The inner harbor of Baltimore in 2026 is everything Napoleon has been reading about since the campaign was planned. The National Aquarium, the USS Constellation Museum ship, the power plant, Camden Yards visible to the southwest, the city's distinctive row house neighborhoods rising on the hills above the waterfront. Napoleon is 56 years old in 2026, older than he ever got in history, where he died at 51 on St. Helena, and there is something in the way he looks at the inner harbor that his aide-de-camp, who has been with him since Austerlitz, later describes as different from how he looked at Vienna, Madrid, Moscow, or any of the other great cities he entered in triumph. He says to his aide, "This is a port city. It understands trade. It understands the value of what passes through it." He pauses. He says it's more like Marseille than Paris. His aide says, "Is that good, General?" Napoleon says, "It means the people here are practical. Practical people make better agreements than proud ones. Send for the mayor." Napoleon's Day 2 reconnaissance of Baltimore is the most thorough personal reconnaissance of any commander in this series, more systematic than Alexander's, more analytical than the Roman generals, more strategically focused than any previous invader. He rises at 4 a.m. as he always does, and spends 3 hours studying the maps, the drone footage, the intelligence reports. By 7 a.m. he is on horseback moving through the city with a small escort. Not the inner harbor, not the tourist Baltimore, but the industrial Baltimore, the port infrastructure, the rail yards, the road network, the neighborhoods. He stops at the B&O Railroad Museum, the oldest railroad museum in America, housed in a roundhouse built in 1884, sitting on the site of the original Mount Clair station where American railroad history began. Napoleon, who understood better than any commander of his era that logistics determines the outcome of campaigns, whose Russian disaster was caused precisely by the failure of his supply system, stands in the B&O Railroad Museum's roundhouse and looks at the locomotives for 25 minutes. His chief engineer stands beside him. Napoleon says, "When was the first railroad built?" His engineer, who has been briefed extensively on the modern world, says 1825 in England. Napoleon says, "I was on St. Helena in 1825. He is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "We would have used this." He says it the way a man says something he will think about for the rest of his life. On day 3, Napoleon goes to Fort McHenry, not to inspect the military position. His corps have bypassed it completely, and the garrison, surrounded and cut off from resupply, is in negotiation with his chief of staff about terms. He goes because he read about the Star-Spangled Banner in his campaign preparation, and he wants to see the flag. The garrison commander, who negotiated the terms of the fort's investment the previous day and has developed, in 48 hours of contact with the French command, a complicated professional respect for the military operation that has been conducted against his position, personally escorts Napoleon into the fort. Napoleon walks the star-shaped perimeter first, examining the walls, the angle of the bastions, the fields of fire. He stops at each point of the star and looks outward. He says to the garrison commander, "This is good work." The garrison commander says, "It was built in 1800. Napoleon says, "I know. He was emperor in 1800. He reaches the flagpole at the center of the fort. The American flag is flying. Napoleon stands under it for 4 minutes. His interpreter explains the history, the 1814 bombardment, Francis Scott Key, the poem that became the anthem. Napoleon listens to all of it. Then he says, "The British bombarded this fort for 25 hours, and the flag was still flying." He looks up at it. He says, "I understand why they wrote a song about that." He pauses. He says, "I would have written one too." The negotiation opens at Baltimore City Hall, the second Empire-style building completed in 1875, that Napoleon, briefed on its architectural style, recognizes immediately as belonging to the French architectural tradition. He says when he enters it, "They built a building." His interpreter says, "The architectural style was named after your nephew." Napoleon says, with the particular expression that his aide-de-camp has learned to recognize as genuine pleasure rather than performed imperial satisfaction. Good taste is hereditary. The mayor of Baltimore, the same mayor who has handled 2 previous ancient army campaigns, the Spartan series having established Baltimore as the series opener, meets Napoleon across a table in the council chamber. The negotiation that follows is the most intellectually sophisticated diplomatic exchange in the series because Napoleon is not just a military commander. He is a lawmaker. The Napoleonic Code that he created is still the foundation of the legal system in Louisiana, Quebec, and most of continental Europe. He arrives at the negotiating table not just as a general who has taken the city, but as a man who has spent 20 years thinking about how civilizations are organized, how laws are written, how institutions are built. The mayor, a former law professor, finds herself in the strangest professional conversation of her career, negotiating the terms of a military occupation with a man whose legal innovations she taught in her constitutional law class. The negotiation takes 2 days, and its outcome surprises everyone, including Napoleon's own marshals. He does not ask for tribute. He does not ask for territorial acknowledgement. He does not ask for a formal document of surrender. The Spartans didn't either, but for different reasons. Napoleon asks for 3 things. First, access to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., which he has identified as the largest collection of accumulated human knowledge in the world, and which he wants to spend a week reading. Second, a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, because Napoleon, who reorganized the French economy, established the Banque de France, and created the modern concept of national public finance, wants to understand how the American federal financial system works, and believes an afternoon with the right person could answer questions that have interested him since he first read about the Federal Reserve in his campaign preparation. Third, and this is the request that the mayor takes 40 minutes to agree to, not because it's unreasonable, but because it requires a phone call to the Smithsonian Institution that she was not prepared to make on a Wednesday afternoon. He wants to see the original Star-Spangled Banner, the 30 by 42-foot garrison flag that flew over Fort McHenry in 1814, that Francis Scott Key saw at dawn, that became the national anthem. It is in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and Napoleon wants to stand in front of it. The mayor makes the call. The withdrawal agreement is signed at Baltimore City Hall on day 7. The Grande Armée withdraws south toward the Chesapeake Bay along the same route it used to advance, except this time the withdrawal is not tactical, not covering, not the disciplined fighting retreat that characterized every previous French withdrawal in history. It is orderly, unhurried, and, in a detail that becomes the most talked-about image of the entire campaign, accompanied by music. The Imperial Guard's band, which has been with the army since Austerlitz, and which plays at every significant moment of every campaign, plays as the Guard withdraws through Baltimore's streets. The music they play is not a march. It is a piece Napoleon requested specifically the night before the withdrawal, La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, written during the Revolutionary Wars that Napoleon inherited and transformed. The people of Baltimore, who lined their marble stoops to watch the Spartans leave 2 years earlier, line them again for the French. The reception is different this time. Not the quiet, respectful acknowledgement the Spartans received, but something louder, more complicated, more Baltimore. Someone on a stoop on Charles Street starts playing the Star-Spangled Banner on a trumpet as the Imperial Guard marches past. Napoleon, riding at the rear of the Guard column as he always does at withdrawals, hears it. He stops his horse. He listens to the full anthem. Then he looks at the man on the stoop. He says something to his interpreter. The interpreter calls up to the man. The emperor says, "You play well." The man on the stoop lowers his trumpet. He says, "Tell him I know." Napoleon laughs. It is the first time anyone on the campaign has heard him laugh. He rides on. Every city in this series has revealed something about the force that came to take it. Baltimore revealed something about Napoleon that 200 years of historical biography has debated and never fully resolved. What the man wanted when the wars were over. He asked for a library. He asked for a meeting with a financial official. He asked to see a flag. not the flag of a country he conquered. The flag of a country he never fought, that was founded on principles he both admired and competed with, that built its national anthem around an image. A flag still flying at dawn after a night of bombardment, that he understood completely because it was the same image he had been creating and destroying for 20 years across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, who stood under the Star-Spangled Banner at Fort McHenry and said, "I would have written a song about that too," was not being diplomatic. He was being honest. The man who reorganized France's legal system, created its central bank, built its road network, established its university system, and conquered most of a continent was, underneath all of it, the same thing he had always been, a man who wanted to understand how things worked and build something that lasted. Baltimore, which has the national anthem and Fort McHenry and the B&O Railroad, and 200 years of building things that last, understood him better than most. Subscribe, because part 2 is coming, and Napoleon has a meeting at the Library of Congress.